Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the three most likeliest scenarios in the 2024 presidential election electoral map. What are the three most likely ways this election can end up going either to the left or to the right? So the first scenario we're going to be taking a look at is what if Kamala was to narrowly win this election? And the second one is what if Donald Trump were to barely pull off the victory? And then lastly, to close out the video, the last scenario is going to be what if Donald Trump were to absolutely crush this race and surpass 300 electoral votes in a big margin? But before we get started with these scenarios, make sure you guys are subscribed, click the bell so you don't miss out my content, press the like button, share this video if you're interested. Don't forget we do have memberships. You can find links to that in the description section. So we have three scenarios in this video. Let's begin with the first most likely one, which I don't think is going to happen. In which, what if Kamala Harris, how the electoral map would look like if she barely defeats Donald Trump? Let's start off with the likely states for her. I think Minnesota will be likely if she barely wins the election by probably 5 to 6 percentage points. Tim Walz, obviously her VP. He is the governor of the state. It has that electoral advantage, helping Kamala Harris. That he would help her, I believe. And then also New Hampshire, I believe, is going to vote to the left of Minnesota, which might be surprising, but New Hampshire is actually trending to the left. It is getting bluer. It has a lot of college-educated voters, which Tim Walz, knowing that he, as governor, he focused heavily on education. I think that can, correlate with a lot of New Hampshire voters, especially the college-educated ones, which I just talked about. So those two states would be likely. Also, Minneapolis, the suburbs, especially with that women vote, are really trending towards the left for Kamala Harris. Also, New Mexico is going to be likely for her. She would win it by a margin of somewhere in between 7 to 10 percentage points, a likely one, comfortable, because obviously Albuquerque is a Democratic stronghold county. It's hard for Trump to overcome the votes in there. It has a lot of white liberals in that county. So now moving on to the likely states for Donald Trump. I think Florida is going to be likely for him. I also do think that Texas would remain likely for him as it was in 2020. He won it by over 5 percentage points. Those states won't get too close, even though they're still considered battleground states. I just think the entirety of Florida has abandoned the Democratic Party. I think it's too far to the right for any Democrat to overcome, no matter the candidate, whether it's a strong candidate or a weak one. It doesn't really matter. No matter what, Florida will always remain red, especially Cuban Americans, Hispanics specifically are really trending towards the right in the state. You take a look at Miami-Dade County, flip from blue to red to DeSantis in the 2022 midterms. He nearly got 20 percentage points, and even someone like Marco Rubio managed to get around 13%. So those states won't get too close. Also, Texas is a border state. Immigration is a losing issue for Kamala Harris. She can't address the border whatsoever at all. And then moving on to the lean states for both of these candidates. If Kamala Harris were to barely win the election, I think she's going to win the state of Virginia by a lean margin of probably a little over 4 percentage points. If I had to make a guess with that margin, I'd say like 4 to 5. And I think that's honestly the only lean state for her in this scenario if she were to barely win the election. I think this state's actually going to get pretty close. I think if you take a look at what Glenn Youngkin is doing, the governor, he's really trying to ensure that Donald Trump does improve on his margins from 2020. Obviously, he's trying to pass election day laws and mandating in-person, paper ballot only voting on election day. And he actually even removed, according to him, non-citizens, which would go to Donald Trump's benefit, and the state would also be called faster ultimately. But obviously, Virginia is a left-leaning state, therefore Trump's not going to win it no matter how close it does get. It would be within 4 to 5 points for Kamala Harris if she were to narrowly win the election in this scenario. And I don't think there will actually be any lean states for Donald Trump in this scenario if Kamala were to barely pull off the victory. So we're just going to be moving straight to the tilt states before we move on to the next scenario, starting off with Kamala Harris. I think she's barely going to pull off the victory in Wisconsin by about a percentage point, a tilt margin. And I think she's barely going to win Michigan by in between 0 to 1%. There was a large uncommitted vote share, but regardless, it still was the bluest Rust Belt state of the three in 2020 and 2016 and the Obama era as well. Michigan voted to the left of both Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, so I won't be shocked if Kamala does end up winning the state, especially if she were to barely win the election. And she would also win Pennsylvania. These three blue wall states typically votes in the same direction together, so if they were to break or split apart in this election, that would be pretty odd if that were to happen. probably Trump would win Wisconsin but lose Michigan and Pennsylvania at the likeliest scenario if they were to split, but I don't think they will. They probably would vote in the same way once again as they always typically do. As far as Wisconsin goes, obviously the state voted to the right of Pennsylvania and Michigan back in the last election, so probably Trump has his best shot in the state of Wisconsin. But if you actually take a look at the polling data, if you trust the polls, which a lot of people don't, Wisconsin is actually bluer than Pennsylvania in terms of the polling averages, and Michigan as well, which is actually surprising. If Wisconsin goes to her, then Pennsylvania would as well. If Michigan goes to Kamala, then Pennsylvania might as well. They vote in the same direction, which is why I think she keeps all three of those blue wall states if she were to narrowly pull off the victory. Meanwhile, as for the Trump tilt states, he's barely going to win Nevada. He's barely going to win Arizona. Actually, no, I do have Kamala winning Nevada. If you actually take a look at 2020, this state really didn't see a shift at all towards the right. And 2016, Hillary Clinton and Biden literally had around the same margins. And Republicans are overhyped and overestimated in Nevada every single time. For example, 2022, they predicted Adam Laxalt would defeat Catherine Cortez Masto. That didn't happen. The polls overestimated him on 538, which is supposed to overestimate Democrats, but it actually overestimated Republicans in Nevada. So Nevada is really odd. If you take a look at any other swing state, then yes, they do overestimate Democrats, but apparently Nevada is that one state that weirdly overestimates Republicans. So I do think that Kamala actually has a better chance of winning Nevada than what the polls currently show. So she gets 276 electoral votes in a really close election, and I still do think Trump is going to win the state of Georgia in 2024, no matter if he does win or lose the election, as well as North Carolina would also be tilt for him. So he's going to get 262 electoral votes in this scenario if he were to barely lose the election. So we go back to Nevada. If Trump flips Washoe County, then I think Kamala Harris can be in jeopardy of actually losing the state. But if she somehow holds on to Washoe County and has at least decent numbers in the Vegas area or Clark County among Hispanic voters, which according to polls is actually showing Trump is doing tremendously better, then I think she does have a shot of keeping Nevada blue. And you take a look at 2016, the election. Some people are saying that Kamala is polling worse than Hillary Clinton. Well, she is. And so I do think that, considering that Hillary Clinton, who is arguably a weak candidate and an establishment candidate similar to Kamala Harris, who won Nevada by over 2 points, and Kamala Harris is giving the same amount of vibes, I think, considering Hillary Clinton won it, I definitely think Kamala can win Nevada as well. And then as for Arizona, no matter if Kamala barely wins this election or not, I still have Trump winning Arizona because it's just a border state, and that's like the number one priority issue to a lot of these voters out there. And even if she wins Maricopa by, like, let's just say 1% as an example, that's not enough for her to actually win this state, as Biden won Maricopa by 2, but only won by a small margin of 0.4 or 0.3 percentage points, roughly 11,000 votes. And a lot of the McCain-style voters, people on the right call them neocons, broke for Biden in 2020 because he was seen as more of a moderate candidate. Kamala is nowhere near moderate, so I actually see a lot of them going back to Donald Trump, and maybe he can do somewhat better among independent voters. So regardless if Kamala wins or loses the election, I don't think Arizona would be part of her pathway. Maybe for Democrats in 2028, they will win Arizona once again as Biden did in 2020 because it is a left-trendy state. And then as for Georgia, I don't think it's going to be enough for Kamala to win the state. Biden only won it because he got high turnout in Atlanta, the metropolitan area, the suburbs, among African-American voters, and she does not have the enthusiasm. It's pretty much simple at this point. It's just clear. She just doesn't have the enthusiasm as Biden did. Trump had to face all these things against him. He had COVID, he had the BLM, he had the major celebrity endorsements go against him in Biden's favor. Kamala doesn't have that this time around. So as for North Carolina, obviously the state voted to the right of Georgia in 2020. Therefore, if Georgia goes to Trump, obviously North Carolina, in my opinion, would do the same as well. So in the first scenario for this video, Kamala gets 276, narrowly defeating Trump to his 262 electoral votes. Now we move on to the second scenario, in which if Trump, basically the opposite, if Trump barely defeats Kamala Harris, winning his second and final non-consecutive term. So for this scenario, I do think that New Hampshire will remain likely for Kamala regardless. Same thing goes for New Mexico, but Minnesota will drop down to the lean column, and Virginia will remain lean for Kamala Harris. If Trump barely wins the election, I have Kamala winning Virginia by around 4 percentage points. And as for Minnesota, probably around the same, probably under 5 percentage points for Kamala Harris. And then the lean states for Donald Trump, if he were to narrowly pull off the election in this scenario, in my opinion, is going to be Arizona, is going to be lean for him. Obviously, just like I mentioned earlier, immigration is a losing issue for Kamala Harris. And even the governor here, who you can argue did not have the best relations with Donald Trump, actually endorsed Trump. And he won in his final race a few years ago by double digits. So maybe that can help as well. And then in Georgia, I do think that he will win this state regardless by probably a little over a percentage point. Even if Kamala were to win the election, I think her pathway is probably through the Rust Belt and not through Georgia, which is why even if Kamala narrowly wins the election, it won't be through Georgia. It's going to be through the Rust Belt. So if Trump barely wins the election, he's going to win by even more than that. And North Carolina is going to actually improve for Trump to the lean column instead of the tilt if he narrowly wins the election. And then Nevada, I do think, is going to be tilt for Donald Trump. I think, just like I mentioned earlier, if he flips Washoe County, then that probably means he's on track to flipping this state, as George W. Bush did, the 2004 election. And then in Wisconsin, I do think Trump will narrowly pull off this state if we were to narrowly win the election, and that already puts him at 278 electoral votes. Keep in mind, he can win the election without winning Nevada, by just winning Arizona, flipping Georgia, keeping North Carolina, and winning just one Rust Belt state. All he needs is one Rust Belt state, not two, not three, and I think the best chance is probably through Wisconsin because it literally was the reddest of the three in the 2020 election in 2016 and the Obama era as well. For the most part of that, I believe so. Now, she can still win Michigan. Let's just say she does because it was the bluest of the three in 2020. And let's just say she somehow holds on to Pennsylvania, even though the polls are suggesting it is actually the reddest Rust Belt state other than Michigan. So Trump is going to win 278 electoral votes in this scenario if he were to barely pull off the election. To Kamala Harris's 260. And if Kamala barely wins the election, she would get 276 electoral votes. And now we move on to the last and final scenario before I end off this video, in which what if Donald Trump were to absolutely crush Kamala Harris, surpassing over 300 electoral votes, basically almost in a landslide. I wouldn't really call it a landslide, but I would call it a major big victory, similar to 2016. Let's just say, what if we see a 2016 repeat? How would the electoral map would look like? I think instead of tilt for Nevada, it's actually going to be lean, so he would expand on his margins in there. I think Arizona will remain lean for him. Probably instead of the 2 that I originally had him winning it by, it would expand to 4, a greater amount than that. Georgia, instead of that being tilt, it would improve for Donald Trump. Lean if we were to see a similar election to 2016, basically a major victory for Donald Trump. And there's no way I see Kamala getting close to 300 electoral votes, which is why I think that scenario would not be likely, which is why I did not consider it for this video. And then I do think that Virginia would be dropped down, narrowed up to the tilt margin. I think Kamala barely wins this state by about a percentage point, because if you actually take a look, when Biden was still in this race, the week right before he dropped out, Trump had a lead on the RCP averages in the whole state of Virginia by 0.4%, which goes to show you that him winning it maybe is not as unrealistic as some people may think. I think it could go down to the wire, especially if this particular exact scenario were to play out. If we see something similar to a 2016, I think Kamala actually performs worse than Hillary Clinton. Because when you take a look at the national popular vote nationally, Hillary Clinton did better than Kamala Harris on most of the polls on 538, meaning indicating that if Trump, who apparently Clinton actually is doing better than Kamala, already passed 300 electoral votes in 2016, and Kamala is worse than that, then Trump may get close to 320 electoral votes. I'm not going to say that's going to happen, but maybe it does. And I think regardless, Minnesota will stay lean for Kamala because you have that Tim Walz impact effect, whatever you want to call it. So then you have Wisconsin. I think that would actually go up to the lean column for Donald Trump. He'd probably get it close to 2 to maybe 3 percentage points if he's lucky enough. I do think this state obviously was the closest Rust Belt state of the three in 2020. It only went to Biden by 0.6%. Margin of just 20,000 votes. If Trump flips the minds of 20,000 people, then he's going to win the state, which I think he can do exactly that. I think he's going to flip Door County, and Kamala won't have skyrocket turnout in Milwaukee, which is the only reason why Biden won this state 4 years ago. And then you have Michigan, in which I do think Trump will flip this state if he does end up passing 300 electoral votes. Obviously, he will. You take a look at that large uncommitted vote, like I just said earlier in the video, 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries. And I understand that was against Joe Biden, but it goes to show you that the Democrats don't really have the enthusiasm as they once did in this state. I think in places like Dearborn County, Michigan, I think that's where Trump can really perform very heavily in there, even though it's still considered a Democratic county. Dearborn would still be way closer than what it once was in the last election. Also, a Democratic mayor from the state of Michigan, I believe, endorsed Donald Trump. A Democratic mayor, not even an independent, guys, which goes to show you that Donald Trump is really favored in this state. And then as for Pennsylvania, Donald Trump would also flip this state by probably, you can argue, a lean margin. I would say a little over 1 percentage point. You take a look at places like Erie County, which is a tipping point county. Obviously, you have Northampton, which I think is going to flip both those counties. Northampton only went to Biden by 0.7. And where he got shot at, Butler County, is right next door to Pittsburgh, which I think he can possibly run up the numbers in some of these stronghold Democratic counties, such as Philadelphia as well, and Central County as well. If he gets a high enough turnout, Central only went to Biden by a little over 4 points. He doesn't have to win it, but I think if he does make improvements, which he will, he probably will win Pennsylvania at the end of the day, which is exactly what the polls are showing. So he's going to get 312 electoral votes in this scenario if he were to absolutely crush Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is 226 electoral votes. So let me know which scenario you probably think is the most realistic. The first one, which Kamala barely wins, or the second one, where Trump barely wins. Both are actually close. Or the last one, which is this one, in which this is not really a close election. Trump crushes Kamala Harris. I think those three are probably the most likely scenarios. I just don't see a scenario in which Kamala absolutely crushes Trump, getting close to 300 electoral votes. I just don't see that. I think the most electoral votes she can get is probably 276. So that's pretty much it. One last final reminder is to subscribe, click the bell so you don't miss out on my content, press the like button, share this video if you're interested. Don't forget we do have memberships. You can find a link to that in the description section. Thank you everyone for watching.